Hello, welcome to the Working Together to Develop Early Social Communication Skills training session. My name's Emily Drake and I am a speech and language therapist. I will be talking you through this training session today, giving you some ideas and some tips on how to support your children in the early years settings with social communication difficulties. So if you're accessing this training session, you should be a member of staff who works in an early years setting. So that's either a school in the early years, reception, nursery, or in a preschool or nursery setting. So the aims of this training session are to firstly develop an understanding of social communication difficulties in the early years. How do they present? What can you be looking out for? And also thinking about what's typical in terms of social communication skills at this age. Provide you with some strategies. So we're going to be talking through some ideas of ways you can support your children in your settings, and also thinking about the use of visual strategies, so using pictures and objects and gestures as a way of helping your child to understand and communicate. And while we talk through all of this, the aim is for you to be coming up with a plan for your individual child based on strategies that we've discussed today. The videos are going to be little short ones, so you can think this one's going to be the first one that discusses the background into communication skills, and then there's going to be another one on communication styles, then one on communication strategies, which might be a good one to go back and look at, and then there's one on visual strategies, and some signposting at the end, so you can work through and revisit those videos whenever you need to. But to start off, watch all of them through in the right order because they build on each other. So, social communication difficulties. So what are social communication difficulties? So we think about it in terms of three key areas when we think about preschool social communication. So obviously there is social interaction. And if you look at the points here on the slide, it's things like eye gaze, looking at the person. It's things like social, emotional, smiling, social reciprocity. So smiling at the other person, engaging in that interaction, showing an interest and noticing the other people around you, giving objects to other people and showing them that you're interested in them. And I think one of the key things in the early years that we can see as a red flag is that children show more of a focus on objects than social interaction. So some of the children who struggle with their social skills can be very fixated on a particular object, but not so interested in other people around them and other people trying to engage and play with them. So social interaction is basically, with our preschool children, their ability to notice other people around them, show an interest in other people around them by looking, smiling, watching what they're interested in. That would be our social communication, social interaction. And then we've got our communication. And so often we think about communication as talking, but there's so many things that come before talking. So there's lots of back and forth babbling that mimic that two-way interaction that's so important for us. Coordinated eye gaze, so this kind of means kind of looking at something, then looking at the person, showing an interest and communicating with the person, like I want that or I like that, looking at them, looking at the object. Using gestures and vocalizations, imitating sounds. These are all ways that a child is communicating before they're using words. And play is, as we know, as early years professionals, is very, very important for development and is one of the indicators of where your child is developing. So children with social communication difficulties, as we've said above, can often be quite focused on objects rather than people, and can be quite fixated on doing things in quite a repetitive manner, and wanting to do things in a certain way. It may be that as well their play is maybe more exploratory in nature, so they like to explore the objects in their environment through mouthing and through touching, which is an earlier stage in play development, rather than showing the play that you might expect for a 2, 3, 4-year-old, which would be showing some kind of pretending. So these children might show limited pretending in their play and might not always use the objects for a functional purpose. They might, it doesn't matter what it is, it could be a train, a sponge, a pencil, a car, they will throw it. And so in that sense, they're not yet at that stage of playing functionally with those objects. But you might start to notice that they do sometimes show those skills, which shows that they're moving on. So these are the 3 key areas that we would look for when we come and observe the child. And they're areas that you can think about in terms of how we can notice how our child is communicating and interacting and build on that to help them to communicate with us more effectively. So one of the main things that we talk about in these training, and when we talk to parents and staff about young children with social communication difficulties, it's about noticing how they are already communicating. And there's a real importance of understanding that child's non-verbal, so non-word communication, and interpreting that and helping them then move on to the next stage, if you like, in a building block type way, to help them to be more intentional behind their communication and ultimately then use some words if they're ready. So, oh, I thought something was going to come up. There we go. So if we think about very basic forms of communication, we've got crying and screaming. So we know if we have a child who is upset and crying, we know that they are upset and crying and that something is upsetting them. We might not necessarily know what it is, but that is a really fundamental form of communication. And we all do it. We all cry and get upset, no matter what age we are. But if we think about tiny babies, newborns, that is their way of communicating. They communicate what they want through crying. So that ultimately means that they get what they want and the adult understands them. So your child might be doing a lot of crying and screaming in the setting, and you're not really sure what's going on. It's very upsetting for everybody involved. But actually that we've got to think about that is that's their way of communicating at the moment. For them, that is the most effective way that they've got to communicate. So we can help build them on from that stage. So the next one would be some kind of gestures. And obviously gestures can be very complicated. You've got things like gesturing, oh, it's about this big, or just gestures in terms of kind of reaching out to what you want, or kind of moving their hands in a certain way to indicate that they need it. So they could kind of open their arms for a cuddle or something like that. And that would be a gesture. So looking at their body language, looking at their gestures to see what they're communicating. Body movements are also very important. So you've got a child who could be very upset and they're moving their body in a way that indicates that they're frustrated, as well as crying or making some kind of vocalization. And they don't need to have said anything to you. You know that that child is upset, and you might be able to know what's upset them if you're able to look at maybe some triggers for that child. It might be that you've taken something away, they make a noise and they move their body, which indicates they don't like that. And that's a really important form of communication. And then you've got reaching and pointing. So that's also a really vital stage in a child's development, because if you think about these previous stages here, so the crying and the body movements and the gesturing, they're not always intentional forms of communication. So they're quite early forms of a child communicating with people that something's going on for them. They might be happy, they might be smiling and wiggling their body with excitement. If you think about young children and they move their legs with excitement, that can be a form of communication, but it's not always intentional. So it relies on you as the adult to interpret what they are trying to communicate with you. Whereas when they get to this stage where they start to reach, that starts to move them forward to actually making an intentional request for something. And it can start off as pre-intentional, as we call it, so before they have direct communicative intent, they might just start to reach out for something that they can't get, and then an adult gives it to them, and then they learn this intentional communication that if they reach and they make a noise, then the adult will give them what they want. And in that way, through that interaction, they develop that intentional communication. So it's really important that we notice these ways that these children are communicating and help build them on so they can communicate with us more intentionally. So they're not just always crying when they get upset. They learn other ways and more desirable ways of communicating with us. Leading you by the hand. A lot of children that I interact with, they do a lot of hand leading, which it shouldn't be underestimated as a form of communication, because you are easily able to see what in the vicinity, if not exactly what they want. So that's really important, because sorry, they're leading you by the hand to show you where they want to go. And what you can do as the adult is maybe just map a key word onto what they're doing. Help, and they'll learn, again, building them up again, they'll learn that every time they want you say help. So maybe they'll start to copy that, and they learn that when they say help, they get what they want, and it builds up this kind of cause and effect relationship. When we work with early communication, a lot of what we're trying to teach is an association, a kind of cause and effect, which is how language and communication develops. We learn that we do something and we get this effect, therefore we're going to do it again, and we do it again. So the best way of teaching our children to develop their communication skills is through lots of consistency and repetition, because the more that we teach them, when they reach, we give them what they want, the more that they're going to reach to get what they want, rather than screaming. So eye gaze is really important, because your child might not be intentionally looking at you and looking at their object, but if you notice what they're looking at and what they're interested in, then that shows us a lot about how that child is trying to communicate with you. So they might be looking at something you've got in your hand, and then you think, oh, they probably want that. And that, rather than reaching and pointing and vocalizing, they might just be looking. And that, again, is a form of communication and should be acknowledged and given some cause and effect. So they look, you give them what they want, and they'll learn that when they do that, they get what they want. Joint attention is, I think I was discussing it a little bit before, where we had that coordinated eye patterns, or whatever it was called. That's joint attention. So it's one of the key things that's really important in a child's development, because studies have shown that when children show joint attention, the likelihood of them going on to develop language and communication skills is much increased, which kind of makes sense, because joint attention is just where you're both looking and engaged in the same thing. So if you have a ball, the baby or the child, they look at you and they look at the ball, they look at you, they look at the ball, and it's not a slow movement, it's quite quick, and you're kind of darting your eyes between the two, but it shows that you're both engaged in the same thing. And that ultimately means that the child is more engaged. When you give them the language for that, they're more likely to pick it up. So that's where that association comes. So if we can get the child to have some level of joint attention, to start to notice you and engage in the same things, that will help them to build up their communication skills. Objects are a way of communicating. Children might show you objects that they want. They might bring you their cup, bring you an apple to make a request, or just to show you because it's cool. And that's a good way of them communicating. And you can do it vice versa. You can show them things for them to understand what you're trying to communicate. Pictures as well are a good way for children to understand, but we will talk about that in a bit more detail later on. Sounds, a lot of our children will make lots of great sounds. Sometimes they'll be for communicative purposes, and sometimes they'll just love making sounds to themselves. But either way, we can build that up to make it communicative by copying those sounds, which we'll talk about later. Echolalia is the definition. It basically describes when children repeat words and phrases that they've heard. And so often people think of echolalia as people repeating whole phrases and words of train times that they've heard, which it is, that is a definition of it. But in the early years, it's important to understand echolalia in a slightly different way, because it is a typical form of communication. So for our children up until the age of 2, typically, children will echo phrases back to you, sometimes in the right context, sometimes not, because they're learning language. And so in the early years and right across, you can use that echolalia as a way of building up the language, because the more that you model that language in the correct context and the child then copies, the more that that child's then going to pick it up and maybe use it independently themselves. So copying and echolalia are a good thing, and it shouldn't really be discouraged, because it's the way, whatever it is, of that child making sense of their environment. So it's really important for them. And then words. So it's not the direct stage approach, but if you think about this mind map here as going around where we started with crying and we've gone all the way to words, it is like how we develop our communication. So it's important to consider all the different ways that a child can be communicating before they're able to use their words. Okay, so we're going to pause here, I think, for the end of this video. But before you switch on the next video, I would have a think about your child, have a think about social interaction, non-verbal and verbal communication and play. Think about how your child is already communicating with you using those ways that we discussed. Jot it down, and then log back in once you've click back on the next video once you've done that. So thank you very much for listening. I'm just trying to now stop the video. I'll stop that. Thank you for listening. That's